Ukrainian mobilization to defend itself. 300,000 volunteers who had previous military experience in the East immediately queued up to the mobilization points, took the arms, men and women, territorial defense. Farmers brought in the drones, said use them. Companies started buying a protective bullet vest, buying whatever equipment was necessary to defend. And then General Zaluzhny, who is now ambassador in Ukraine, in the UK, actually defended Kyiv. That was the very important battle that he won against all the odds, thanks to ingenuity of Ukrainian armed forces, strategy, and asymmetric methods.
Arguably, the rest of the world wasn't prepared for it either. We saw some unprecedented activity where Western intelligence, in particular US and UK intelligence, released some information about Russian outload of blood to blood banks and all the rest of it to try and embarrass the Russians not to come across. But Diane, how embarrassed do you think that the West was in its lack of preparation for the shock that hit economically across the world with Russia's illegal full-scale invasion?
Well, I think the shock was that they actually invaded and went right for the jugular, which was to occupy and kill everybody in government in Kyiv. And the fact that a guerrilla force grew up from nothing. And of course, I wrote a piece before when there was talk of this happening. And I wrote a piece and I said, Mr. Putin, every window will shoot. In other words, every Ukrainian was going to rise up against this. This was historically an abomination. They were armed and ready and quite capable, and we've seen what they've done since. And, that was why he couldn't, and he will never be able to conquer Ukraine, in my opinion. A couple of other things happened in the lead up, though, that were interesting. I think the first full free election federally in Ukrainian history happened, and that was after years of anti-corruption fighting, and Zelensky got elected. And the night he got elected, he turned to the cameras and he said to the rest of the people in the former Soviet Union republics, look at what we have done here. Anything is possible. And I think that was almost, too much for Putin to handle, and also was absolutely correct in terms of stoking problems for the rest of the former Soviet Union. And at the same time, Ukraine's minimum wage overtook Russia's. And that was also an affront to them, that they would not only have a free government with a democracy, but they would have a better economy than Russia's. And I think he said, I've just got to do this.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to 2003 when Putin described Ukraine and Ukrainians as little Russians, turning around and suggesting that it was the same people. There was no difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians, but in a way that was deliberately trying to be offensive, to say that the Ukrainians were actually second-class Russians and not like the rest of Russians, and hence his use of the word little. But Orysia, you talked about a number of international agreements and releases that came out at the end of 2021 that gave clear indications. Do you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so there were a few things happening to which we should have paid attention. One, of course, is the fact that Russians amassed troops in the spring of 2021. And I remember very much pressure that they wanted. This was the moment of pressure without invasion. And President Biden agreed to meet with Putin in Geneva. To be honest, we do not have yet the disclosure of that conversation. But obviously that did not deter Putin from invading Ukraine. So it's an important reflection to make why deterrence didn't work, why we were so slow and fearful in providing defensive weapons to Ukraine, that Ukraine remained basically left to its own defenses. We were still debating whether NLAW's anti-tank, missiles are eligible, javelins, Ukraine had one or two. So Putin, in his cold calculation understood Ukraine is defenseless. Of course, then there was a memorandum that the Russians sent to Washington demanding actually changes in the security arrangement, and they called it, basically demanding that NATO enlargement is annulled and the US military infrastructure rolls back to the border of 1997. That is not about Ukraine. That is actually about the former sphere of control that Russians had after the Second World War, the so-called Warsaw Pact countries. And this is actually what triggered Finnish decision to join NATO. It was not exactly the invasion of Ukraine, but an understanding that the Kremlin is fundamentally imperialist, that they do not treat Eastern Europe as sovereign, Eastern European countries as sovereign nations, and that they are prepared to use hard power to actually impose that decision on Russia's neighbors. So all in all, I think we were caught napping when Putin rearmed. When Putin annexed Crimea, we thought that we will sue, as we are now doing, Land for Peace. Well, he'll just take Crimea and relax. We are now seeing Trump repeating the same mistake, pressuring Ukraine to give the rest of Donbass. And I think what we should today especially mention is the Ukrainian mobilization to defend itself. 300,000 volunteers who had previous military experience in the East immediately queued up to the mobilization points, took the arms, men and women, territorial defense, farmers brought in the drones, said use them, companies started buying protective bullet vests, buying whatever equipment was necessary to defend, and then General Zaluzhny, who is now ambassador in Ukraine, in the UK, actually defended Kyiv. That was the very important battle that he won against all the odds, thanks to ingenuity of Ukrainian armed forces, strategy, and asymmetric methods.
And that's what set the conditions for what has happened over the next 4 years. Now, we've had 4 years of an absolutely horrific conflict when you look at it. But what particular highlights have stood out in your mind, and for what reason, Diane?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I was involved in some of the anti-corruption movement in Kyiv as a Western journalist, and I did what I could to help, and also involved with the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, which is very large. What I also was involved in was software development. I had a project that I was working on because my early days of going there, I'd been in Silicon Valley many times and knew the players. I'd realized, and I'd written stories about this incredible IT sector that was developed in Ukraine. And then I got involved and I got some financing, and we were putting together a software development project. That all is to say that what the miscalculation of Russia is that Ukraine was the Silicon Valley of the Soviet Union. And many of the people that I worked with in Lviv and Kyiv, their grandparents had put Gagarin into space. The Russians did not do the space program. The Russians didn't do the aeronautical stuff. The brain trust of the Soviet Union was Ukraine. And what has happened as a direct result is that many of my friends and so on, that the software development industry, the IT brains, have reinvented warfare. The Ukrainians have reinvented warfare. It is no longer mano a mano. It is no longer about tanks and artillery. It's about drones. And they have been able to sink the Russian Navy in the Black Sea without a Navy with sea drones. They've been able to bomb the heck out of the oil industry inside Russia without an air force, but with drones. So they've lasted because they are a superior group of people, in my opinion, educationally and technologically. And this is something that I think I didn't even foresee, but now looking back on it and through the piece, I've been reflecting and writing about this. It shouldn't be any surprise that they have reinvented warfare.
Well, isn't it interesting, from a historical perspective, that during the Second World War, well, in fact, during the First World War and Second World War, the Allies out-invented the Nazis in the Second World War, and that's what won it. And if we then go into the Cold War, the old Soviet Union was bankrupted by the West out-inventing the old Soviet Union, and it costing the Soviet Union about 10 times the amount to build weapon systems to try and counter what the West had, and then the West would counter that again, and eventually it led to the bankrupting of the Soviet Union. Russia seems to be almost on the same path. But Orysia, over the past 4 years, what things have really stuck in your mind as your significant events?
Well, I follow every day what's happening. It's part of my job, but it's also my homeland. So it's not an easy task, and a lot of scars and some joy, to be honest, because it's a very mixed picture. I mean, the big joy is the fact that Kyiv is standing, that it has a functional government, and Ukraine is and will be on the political map of Europe. But also there were stories like Bucha, when Bucha was liberated, and I still vividly remember that photograph of President Zelensky walking in the streets where there were dead bodies along the trottoirs and mass graves. And I think that is something we should contemplate for a moment, that without accountability for these war crimes, there will never be peace in Europe. We may have a ceasefire, we may have truce, but if this is not, if there's no responsibility for that, no peace. So Bucha is an important scar, but also hopefully something that can renew Europe. Think about the explosion of Kakhovka Dam, the largest dam in the south of Ukraine, irrigating hundreds of millions of acres of land around Kherson. This is what Russians do. They have no respect neither for people nor for nature. They exploded it to delay Ukrainian counteroffensive, to make soil wet, to disable that punch that Zaluzhny was trying to blow through armored counteroffensive in the south, and cut Russia's off from Crimea, to cut them off. And last, think about Kursk. It's for the first time that part of Russian land was occupied, and they could not liberate it themselves. They had to bring in North Koreans to help them squeeze Ukrainians out of that pocket. And there are still, I think, a few villages that Russians did not fully restore control in that oblast. So Ukrainians are very, very inventive. You can keep naming it, the spider web operation. Russians have done nothing but a mint grinder, killing millions of its own people for about, I think, 13% of additional territory that they've occupied in 4 years. That is a very, very lousy war for Putin.
Thank you for watching Frontline. Now, in case you haven't heard, we've got our own channel now. So please subscribe whenever subscriptions start again. But of course, you can still listen to us if you want to on Times Radio at 01:35 hours in the morning Greenwich Mean Time, but that is 20:35 Eastern Standard Time for those in the United States. And of course, please put your comments in and share our link with your friends. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.